The lie of the empath. You're not feeling them. You're disappearing. 1. The beautiful sickness. Every time you feel someone else's pain before your own, you lose a small piece of yourself. You have been told this is a gift. That you were born more sensitive, more attuned, more open than the rest. That the exhaustion you carry is the price of a rare soul. That the storms of other people's emotions passing through your body are proof of your depth. I am here to tell you something you will not want to hear. It is not a gift. It is not depth. It is not a rare soul. It is a symptom. A precise, textbook, clinically observable symptom of something that went wrong before you had language to name it. The word empath has become the most seductive lie of the modern psyche. It takes a wound and dresses it as a crown. It takes a survival strategy and calls it a spiritual gift. It takes the tragic architecture of a self that was never allowed to form and sells it back to you as identity. And you have paid. You have paid with decades of confusion. You have paid with relationships in which you dissolved into other people's needs and then wondered why you were empty. You have paid with a body that will not stop signaling exhaustion, autoimmune flares, unexplained fatigue, migraines, a nervous system that never fully lands. You have paid with the slow, invisible loss of the one thing you were supposed to develop. A center, an I, a place inside you where you end and the world begins. Carl Jung, more than a century ago, described a psychic condition he inherited from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. He called it participation mystique, a state in which the individual has not yet separated from the collective psyche, where the boundary between self and other is porous, unformed, permeable to the point of danger. He did not describe it as a virtue. He described it as the developmental stage that must be overcome for a human being to become a person. The tragedy of our age is that we have taken this unfinished state, this psychic wound, and turned it into an aesthetic. We have influencers celebrating it. We have therapists monetizing it. We have entire spiritual communities built around the premise that dissolving into other people's fields is a form of awakening. It is not awakening. It is regression. And the person calling themselves an empath is not more evolved than the rest of us. They are, in almost every case documented in the serious depth psychological literature, someone who never had the chance to build the container that would allow real feeling to exist inside them. Real empathy requires a self. Real empathy requires a boundary. Real empathy requires that when you meet another human being suffering, there is someone home in your body to receive it, to hold it without becoming it, and to remain intact when the encounter ends. If any of that is missing, what you have is not empathy. What you have is disappearance. And for the next 40 minutes, I am going to walk you, slowly and without mercy, through exactly what happened to you, why it happened, what it is costing you now, and what Jung and the entire tradition of depth psychology insist is the only way out. You are not who you have been told you are. You are something else, and that something else is where your life actually begins. 2. The marketplace of wounded identities. Somewhere in the last decade, the word empath stopped being a clinical curiosity and became a product. Not a metaphorical product, a literal, monetizable, sellable product. Look at any bookstore. Look at any Instagram bio. Look at any dating app in any Western capital. You will find it repeated with the confidence of a diagnosis and the aesthetics of a lifestyle. Empath, highly sensitive, old soul, absorbs energy, needs to protect field, feels everything. Notice something. The vocabulary is not psychological. It is commercial. Someone has done the work of translating a real, painful developmental wound into a marketable identity, and the market has responded with billions of dollars. Courses on empath protection. Crystal kits for empath grounding. meditation programs for empaths, coaching packages for empaths who keep attracting narcissists, entire publishing careers built on telling you that your inability to hold a self is actually your greatest asset. This is not accident. This is the operation of the modern achievement society, meeting the collapse of the traditional structures of meaning. When religion recedes, when community fractures, when the family stops being able to hold you, human beings still need to know who they are. We are meaning-making creatures, and we will pay almost any price for a story about ourselves. The empath identity is one of the most successful stories of the last 20 years because it does something almost no other identity does. It takes suffering and reframes it as superiority. It takes exhaustion and calls it depth. It takes the inability to say no and calls it compassion. It takes the years of dissociating in a room full of louder people and calls it intuitive knowing. And once you accept the identity, you are locked in. Because everything that would have been a symptom pointing you toward real work becomes instead further evidence of your specialness. You cannot hold a boundary. You must be an empath. You cannot recover from a relationship for months. You must be an empath. You feel the emotions of your coworkers, your family, strangers on the train, and it drains you. You must be an empath. The identity is airtight because it consumes every piece of contrary evidence as further confirmation. This is what Jung would have called a persona, so tightly fused to the ego that no real self can develop underneath it. The person believes they are their symptom, and the culture rewards them for it with likes, followers, recognition, and the strange consolation of belonging to a special class of wounded people. I want you to consider, for a moment, what is being taken from you by this arrangement. Not just money, not just years, the possibility of ever meeting the person you actually are. Because as long as you are identified with the empath persona, you are not looking underneath it. You are not asking why the boundary never formed. You are not asking who benefited from your permeability. You are not asking whether the sensitivity is inheritance or injury. You are performing the wound instead of investigating it. And in that performance, in that endless loop of self-description as gifted yet overwhelmed, you are quietly, methodically, being erased from your own life. 3. What Jung actually said. Carl Jung did not use the word empath. He used a phrase that is much more precise and much more damning. Participation mystique. He borrowed it from Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, a French anthropologist studying so-called primitive societies at the beginning of the 20th century. Lévy-Bruhl observed that in certain tribal cultures, the individual did not experience a clear separation between themselves and their totem, their tribe, their ancestors, their dreams, their environment. A hunter and his spear were one being. A mother and her child shared a single skin. A member of the clan who dreamed of a lion had, in some real psychic sense, been the lion. There was no clean line between subject and object, between self and world, between me and not me. Jung took this observation and turned it inward. He said that participation mystique is not something that happened only in ancient tribes. It is the original condition of every human psyche. The infant does not know it is separate from the mother. The child does not know its feelings are its own. The adolescent, if development goes wrong, may never fully learn the difference between what belongs to them and what belongs to the atmosphere around them. Individuation, in the Jungian sense, is the slow, painful, decades-long process of extracting the self from this original fusion, of building an ego strong enough to say, "This is mine," and that is yours. Of learning to feel your own feelings as yours, distinct from the ambient emotional weather of the room you are standing in. Jung was absolutely explicit about this. He described participation mystique as a state of unconscious identity with an object, a person, or a group. It is not empathy. It is not connection. It is not spiritual advancement. It is a failure of differentiation, a psychological state in which the individual has not yet become an individual. He considered it the developmental raw material from which a self must be forged, and he considered failure to complete that forging to be one of the great sources of neurosis in modern life. Now hold that against the current cultural celebration of empathhood. Someone who cannot walk into a room without absorbing the mood. Someone who cannot end a phone call without carrying the caller's grief for hours. Someone who cannot love another person without dissolving into their needs. Someone who cannot distinguish their own opinions from the opinions of whoever spoke last. This is not a higher form of consciousness. This is participation mystique, unresolved, dressed up in the vocabulary of contemporary spirituality. Jung would have looked at the modern empath movement and recognized it immediately. He would have said, "These are people whose ego never fully separated from the maternal field, whose psyche remains porous to the collective unconscious, and who have been told by their culture that their unfinished state is a virtue." He would have warned that identifying with this state, calling it your true self, is the surest way to guarantee that you never move beyond it. Because you cannot heal what you have chosen to worship. You cannot integrate what you have made the center of your identity. The empath, in Jungian terms, is not a soul more evolved than others. The empath is a soul who has been convinced that the doorway is the destination, that the wound is the light, that the psychic condition that ought to be the beginning of the work is, instead, the end of it. Before I go further, one thing needs to be named. If what I have just described has already found something in you, if you are recognizing your own life in these words, I built a structured process for exactly this recognition. It is called the S.I.M method, a slow, systematic path out of participation mystique and into a real self. The link is in the description and pinned in the top comment. It is not a course about becoming a better empath. It is a process for building the self that was never allowed to form. Now let us look at what real empathy actually is, and how different it is from the thing you have been performing your entire life. 4. The two kinds of feeling. There is a distinction the empath discourse refuses to make, and until you make it, you will remain lost. There is mature empathy, and there is unconscious fusion. They look similar from the outside. They feel almost identical when you are inside one, and have never experienced the other. But structurally, they are opposites. Imagine a river. Mature empathy is standing on the bank. You can see the water clearly. You can feel its cold reaching you through the air. You can understand its speed, its depth, its temperature. You can even reach in with your hand, feel the current, and know something real about it. But you are not the river. You are the person on the bank, observing, receiving, comprehending. And when you walk away, you are still dry. You are still yourself. The river continues on its own path, and you continue on yours, and both of you are undiminished by the encounter. That is empathy. Real, adult, sustainable empathy. Now imagine falling into the river. Imagine having no bank to stand on because no bank was ever built. Imagine being pulled by the current the moment you approach, dragged along its trajectory, cold to your bones, unable to distinguish the water from your own body. Imagine emerging, hours or days later, downstream, exhausted, unsure whether the wet skin belongs to you or to the water that carried you. That is what the culture calls being an empath. It is not empathy. It is drowning that has been given a beautiful name. The critical variable, the one thing that separates the person on the bank from the person in the water, is a formed ego, a self, a center of consciousness that can meet another human being's emotional reality without collapsing into it. Jung was insistent on this point, and every serious depth psychologist since has agreed. You cannot give what you do not have. You cannot offer presents to another person if there is no one home in you. You cannot understand another human being's pain if you are simply absorbing it as though you were a piece of wet paper laid across their wound. Absorption is not understanding. Fusion is not connection. Dissolution is not love. The person who feels everything of everyone at all times is not a highly attuned witness of the human condition. They are someone whose psychic membrane never sealed, whose developmental process was interrupted before the container was complete, who now moves through the world as an open wound, mistaking the constant leakage of other people's emotions into their body for a sixth sense. And this is the cruelty of the empath identity. It takes the person who most needs to develop a self, and it tells them their lack of self is their gift. It takes the person whose greatest task is to build a boundary, and it tells them their boundarylessness is their spiritual advancement. It takes the person who is exhausted, depleted, unable to rest in their own skin, and it tells them the exhaustion is proof of their depth. Meanwhile, the person on the bank, the one with a real self, the one who has done the slow work of individuation, is capable of empathy so profound and so sustainable that they can sit with another human being's dying, or grief, or rage, and offer real presence, and walk away intact. That is what you were meant to become. Not a river, a bank. 5. Why narcissists find you. Every person who identifies as an empath has, at some point, asked the same question. Why do I keep attracting narcissists? Why is my mother one? Why was my first love one? Why is my boss one? Why does every friendship, every romantic entanglement, every professional dynamic seem to end with me depleted and them refilled? The empath discourse offers a mystical answer. Narcissists are drawn to your light. Narcissists feed on empath energy. You are a beacon, and they are a moth, and this is your fate. I am going to give you the structural answer. The one that does not flatter you, and does not console you, and does not build a spiritual explanation around a psychological mechanism. Narcissists find you because narcissism and unconscious fusion are complementary structures. They fit together the way a key fits a lock. Not because of energy, because of geometry. The narcissistic personality is characterized, in the clinical and depth psychological literature, by a fragile grandiosity that requires constant external mirroring to remain intact. The narcissist needs a supply. Not affection, not love. A mirror, a surface onto which their inflated self-image can be projected and reflected back to them without distortion. An ordinary person, an individuated person, a person with a formed self is a terrible mirror, because they have their own reality, their own opinions, their own emotional weather that will not conform to the narcissist's needs. An individuated person is opaque. They cannot be looked through. They cannot be used as a screen. Now consider the person who has never developed the boundary, the person whose psyche remains fused, permeable, absorbent. That person is a perfect mirror. Their own inner life is so faint, so uncertain, so easily overridden by the emotional field of whoever they are with, that they can become, effortlessly, whatever the narcissist needs them to be. The narcissist projects an image. The empath absorbs it. The narcissist demands admiration. The empath, having no counter-self to protect, provides it. The narcissist punishes with withdrawal. The empath, terrified of the emotional vacuum, chases. This is not magic. This is not spiritual attack. This is not moth and flame. This is two incomplete psychic structures finding each other and locking into a dynamic that neither of them could sustain with a whole person. And here is the part that will hurt. The narcissist is not more sick than you. They are exactly as sick as you. They are the outward-facing version of the same developmental failure. Where you dissolved outward into the field, they inflated inward into a defensive fortress. Both of you failed to build a real self. Both of you are working from unresolved participation mystique. Both of you are trying to compensate, in opposite directions, for the same original wound. This is why the pattern repeats. Not because you are cursed, not because narcissists are supernatural predators, because your psychic structure, as it currently stands, is precisely the shape that fits into theirs. And until you build a self, you will keep finding them. Or, more accurately, they will keep finding you, because the world contains a fixed proportion of narcissistic personalities, and they are all scanning for the exact absence you are broadcasting. The only way out is not better boundaries with them. The only way out is a self they cannot use. A self so intact, so present, so unwilling to dissolve, that the narcissistic structure finds no purchase and moves on to easier terrain. That is what individuation buys you, not perfect relationships. Immunity to a specific and devastating pattern of relational catastrophe. 6. The mother who was never there. We now have to look at where this begins. Because the empath is not born. The empath is made. And the making happens early, in the years before you had memory, before you had language, before you had any capacity to name what was being done to you or to refuse it. I want you to consider a specific childhood. Not the only one that produces this structure, but the most common one. You had a mother who was not fully available. Perhaps she was depressed, and her inner world was so heavy she could not attend to yours. Perhaps she was narcissistic and required you to attend to her instead of the reverse. Perhaps she was anxious and her nervous system flooded the room with a fear you learned to breathe as your own air. Perhaps she was simply overwhelmed, exhausted, unsupported, drowning in her own life, and you learned very early that if you added your needs to hers, the whole system would collapse. Whatever the specific form, the structural fact was the same. The environment could not meet you. You had to meet the environment. An infant is supposed to be held in a psychic container built by the mother. The mother is supposed to metabolize the infant's overwhelming affects, to receive them, to soften them, to return them in a form the infant can bear. This is what the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion called reverie. When it works, the infant develops, gradually, the capacity to hold its own emotions. The container becomes internalized. The self begins to form. When it does not work, when the mother cannot metabolize her own life, let alone the infant's, the child develops a different capacity. Not the capacity to hold their own emotions. The capacity to scan the mother's. Because if the mother's state is unstable, and the child's survival depends on the mother, the child's psyche will develop a hyper-vigilant attention to the mother's emotional weather. The child becomes an instrument for reading the room. Before they have learned to feel themselves, they have learned to feel her. And once that pattern is set, it generalizes. The child grows up scanning every room, every friend, every teacher, every partner. The nervous system that was calibrated in infancy to read the mother's mood as a matter of survival never turns off. It just widens its aperture. By the time this person reaches adulthood, they will describe themselves as sensitive. They will describe themselves as attuned. They will describe themselves eventually as an empath. But what they actually are is a survivor of a childhood in which their own emotional reality was subordinated, from before memory began, to the emotional reality of a caregiver who could not hold them. They learned to feel outward before they learned to feel inward. They developed a receptive apparatus of extraordinary sensitivity and a self-generating apparatus of almost none. And this is why, decades later, they cannot say what they want for dinner without first checking the face of whoever is with them. Why they cannot end a relationship even when it is destroying them. Why they cannot rest in a room alone without feeling that something is wrong. The nervous system is doing what it was built to do. It is scanning for the mother who was never there. And every unavailable partner, every narcissistic boss, every friend who takes and does not give, is a fresh iteration of the original figure the child was designed from the beginning, to try to reach. Pause here for a moment, because everything I have just described has a specific developmental map, and there is a specific process for working with it. The S.I.M method, linked in the description, is that process. It does not tell you to feel less. It teaches you, step by patient step, how to build the internal container that should have been built for you before you had memory. If this is your life we are describing, that is your next step. Now let us look at what this childhood has cost your body. 7. The body that carries what was never yours. Look at your body, not metaphorically, literally. Look at the specific signals your body has been sending you for years, and consider that they are not random, and they are not a mystery, and they are not evidence of some rare sensitivity. They are the receipt for a lifetime of carrying what does not belong to you. The person who has never built a psychic boundary does not stop absorbing when the day ends. They do not stop absorbing when they leave the room. They do not stop absorbing when they finally get into bed at night, alone, and try to sleep. The absorbed material stays. It has to go somewhere. And because there is no strong ego, no differentiated self, no internal filing system to say this is mine and this is yours, the absorbed emotional weight of every interaction, every conversation, every scan of every room gets deposited into the only container available, the body. This is not New Age poetry. This is now well documented across trauma research, polyvagal theory, and the entire literature on adverse childhood experiences. People whose nervous systems were shaped by caregivers they could not rely on develop, over time, characteristic patterns of somatic disturbance. Chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep touches, autoimmune conditions, digestive problems that shift and migrate and refuse to be diagnosed, muscle tension that lives in the shoulders, the jaw, the pelvic floor, migraines, fibromyalgia, a general sense of being unwell in a way that never quite becomes a specific illness. You have probably been to doctors. You have probably been told that everything looks normal. You have probably been given the diagnosis of exclusion, which is really a confession that no one knows what is wrong with you. I am going to tell you what is wrong with you. You have been storing, in the tissue of your body, decades of emotional material that belonged to other people. Every argument you absorbed as a child instead of hiding from. Every moment of your mother's anxiety that passed through your nervous system before your prefrontal cortex could interpret it. Every friend who unloaded on you for hours. Every partner whose rage or sadness or shame you took inside yourself because you did not have a self solid enough to say, "This is not mine." The body kept it. The body is still keeping it. And no amount of yoga, no amount of meditation, no amount of essential oils, no amount of empath protection crystals is going to release material whose accumulation is structural. You cannot symptom manage your way out of a missing ego. You cannot lifestyle hack your way out of participation mystique. The exhaustion you feel is not a mystery. It is the labor of holding, without complaint, the effective weight of every person you have ever encountered, because you were never given the internal architecture to refuse. And the deepest cruelty is that as long as you identify with the empath persona, you will interpret this suffering as further evidence of your gift. You will say, "I am so sensitive that even a coffee shop drains me." You will say, "I need to protect my energy because I feel everything." You will not say, "I am carrying, in my body, the emotional runoff of a lifetime of undefended contact with other human beings, and my body is telling me it can no longer hold it." That is the truth. And your body already knows it. You are the one who has been unwilling to listen. The body has been the whistleblower of the psyche your whole life. It has been trying to tell you, through symptom after symptom, that the arrangement is not sustainable. Every autoimmune flare is the body attacking itself, because it can no longer distinguish self from foreign. Every wave of unexplained fatigue is the body refusing, in the only language it has, to keep carrying material that was never assigned to it. Every migraine is a demand for the boundary the psyche will not build. And when you finally begin to build that boundary, when you finally begin the work of individuation, the body responds. Not immediately, not miraculously, but over months and years, the symptoms that no doctor could name begin, slowly, to loosen their grip. Because the container is finally forming, and the material is finally, correctly, being returned to sender. 8. You have never known what you feel. Now, I have to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it, because it is the question everything else has been leading to. What do you actually feel? Not what does the room feel, not what does your partner feel, not what does your mother feel, your child feel, your co-worker feel, the stranger on the train feel. You, right now, underneath the ambient emotional weather you have been reading your entire life, underneath the affects you have absorbed today, this week, this decade. What do you feel? If a long silence just opened inside you, if the question landed and there was no immediate answer, if you noticed yourself reaching for what someone else would want you to feel, rather than what is actually there, I want you to stay with that silence. Because that silence is the most important information you have ever received about yourself. That silence is the shape of the self that was never allowed to form. The person who developed under conditions of participation mystique, of unmet developmental needs, of mothers who could not hold and fathers who could not see, does not lose the capacity to feel. They lose the capacity to feel themselves. They can feel everyone. They cannot feel me. Ask them what they want, and they will produce an answer, but if you slow the question down, if you press on it, they will realize the answer was generated to please you, or to seem reasonable, or to not disturb the atmosphere. Ask them what they need, and they will hesitate, and eventually offer something they think is small enough to be permitted. Ask them who they are, apart from the roles they play for other people, and you will meet a fog. Not because they are stupid, not because they are avoiding, because the region of the psyche that was supposed to develop into a self-knowing consciousness was, in childhood, redirected outward. The apparatus was built to know the mother. It was never built to know itself. And now, in adulthood, the person carries a sophisticated instrument of external perception and a nearly empty instrument of internal perception. They can tell you, with unnerving precision, what their partner is feeling in the next room. They cannot tell you, with any confidence, what they themselves are feeling right now. This is the deepest cost. Not the exhausted body, not the narcissistic relationships, not the endless dissolving into other people's fields. The cost is that you have lived your entire life at a distance from yourself. You have never met the person you are. You have only ever met the person you became in order to survive. And every choice you have made, every relationship, every career, every apparent preference, has been made by that survival persona, not by the self underneath it. Because the self underneath it never got to speak, never learned language, never developed the confidence that its own reactions were valid, its own hunger was legitimate, its own no was allowed. The self underneath is still, in a certain sense, 4 years old, still watching the mother's face, still waiting for permission to feel what it feels, still assuming that whatever wants to emerge must first be checked against the emotional weather of the room. And every day you continue to identify as an empath, every day you continue to celebrate your permeability as a gift, is another day that self is left waiting for a permission that has to come from you. Because there is no one else who can give it. Stay with me here. If this section has just landed with the force I think it has, if you have recognized the silence at the center of your own life, the work of meeting that silence is not something you do alone in a comment section. The S.I.M method is the structured process, and the link is in the description and pinned in the top comment. Do not close this video and let this recognition dissipate. Recognitions of this weight fade within hours if they are not acted upon. Take the next step now, while the truth is still loud enough to move you. 9. The return of the self. There is a way out of this. I need to say that clearly, because everything I have just walked you through can, in the wrong hands, become another identity to be trapped inside. The wounded empath, the failed boundary case, the person who now identifies as insufficiently individuated instead of over-empathic. That is not the point. The point is that Jung, and every serious depth psychologist who followed him, described a specific process by which a person moves from participation mystique to what he called individuation, from fusion to distinctness, from absorbed to whole. He did not describe it as easy. He did not describe it as quick. He described it as the central task of adult human life, the work that begins in earnest around the middle years, and that, if undertaken seriously, produces a kind of person the world does not manufacture on its own, a person with a formed self. The process begins with what he called the withdrawal of projections. Every effect you have been carrying that does not belong to you, every emotion you have been sourcing from the environment instead of from within, every reaction you have assumed must be true because it arrived in your body, has to be examined. You have to learn to ask, before you feel, whose feeling is this? You have to learn to sit in a room with another person and notice, with slow attention, the difference between what they are broadcasting and what is originating in you. At first, you will find nothing originates in you. That is expected. The self-generating apparatus is atrophied. It has to be exercised. It has to be given time, silence, permission, the daily discipline of asking, what do I actually think, want, feel, need? You will find, initially, that the answer takes minutes to surface, then hours, then you begin to catch it in the moment. You will find that many of your former certainties dissolve. The relationships that felt inescapable will begin to look like patterns you can now step out of. The urgency you felt to attend to everyone will begin to feel less compulsory and more optional. The exhaustion will begin, slowly, to lift, because you are no longer carrying what does not belong to you. Alongside this outer work, Jung insisted on the inner one. The confrontation with the shadow, the parts of you that were unacceptable to the original environment and were therefore split off into unconsciousness. Your anger, your grief, your sexuality, your ambition, your rage at the mother who could not hold you, your grief for the child you were. These have to be met. They have to be admitted back into consciousness. They have to be given a seat at the table of who you are. Because as long as they remain split off, the self remains fragmented, and fragmented selves cannot hold boundaries. The full self, integrated shadow and all, is what holds. Jung called this the emergence of the self, capitalized, the center of the psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious material. The organizing principle that makes a whole life possible. He did not consider this a mystical achievement. He considered it the ordinary work of a human being who takes their own existence seriously. And the person who completes even the early stages of this work becomes, over years, unrecognizable to their former self. Not louder, not harder, not less kind. Present, for the first time. Present. The person who was once permeable becomes intact. The person who was once absorbing becomes receiving. The person who was once dissolving on contact becomes someone whom another human being can actually meet. And meeting, real meeting, is what the empath persona was always secretly reaching for and could never achieve. Because you cannot meet another person when there is no one home in you. You can only be occupied by them. Individuation is the process of finally being home when someone knocks. 10. What empathy actually is. I want to close with the reveal, because everything I have said so far may sound like an argument against empathy itself, and it is not. It is an argument for the only kind of empathy that is real. Empathy, in its true form, is not the absence of a self. It is the presence of one, so stable and so intact that it can meet another human being in the full reality of who they are, without collapsing into it. The person who has done the work of individuation, who has built a self through the slow labor described in the last section, does not lose the capacity to feel with others. They gain it, for the first time, because the feeling now comes from a formed place, not from a permeable one. They can sit with a friend in grief and remain present. They can hold a partner in rage and not be swept away. They can witness a child's overwhelming affect and offer, instead of absorption, a containing presence, the very reverie that was never offered to them. This is the paradox at the heart of everything I have said. Real empathy is only possible after you have stopped being an empath. Real feeling is only possible after you have built the container that can hold it. Real love is only possible after you have become someone capable of remaining yourself in the presence of another. Everything before that is not love. Everything before that is fusion, mistaken for love, absorption mistaken for care, dissolution mistaken for depth. And the tragedy of the empath identity, the reason I have spent this entire video dismantling it, is that it convinces the person who most needs to build a self that their absence of self is already an achievement. It locks them out of the very transformation that would give them everything they thought empathy was supposed to give them. Deep connection, meaningful presence, the experience of really meeting another human being. None of that is available to a person who dissolves on contact. All of that becomes available, gradually, to a person who has become someone. You were told, for years, that you were gifted. I am telling you that you were injured. You were told that your permeability was your soul. I am telling you that your permeability was the shape your wound took. You were told that becoming less empathic would be a loss. I am telling you that becoming less empathic, in the sense the culture uses that word, is the precondition for becoming, at last, capable of empathy, in the sense Jung meant. Presence. Held. Whole. The descent into this material, into the recognition that everything you thought was your gift was actually your unfinished work, is not an ending. It is the beginning of the only life that will ever feel like yours. And this is what the entire tradition of depth psychology exists to make possible. Not to celebrate the wound, not to worship the dissolution, to walk you, patient step by patient step, out of participation mystique and into individuation, out of the field and into the self, out of the endless drowning and onto the bank. If you have listened this far, you already know which one you have been living. You already know which one is waiting. And you already know, in the place beneath all the identities you have collected, that the person waiting on the bank has been waiting for you your entire life. It is time to meet them. If you are ready to begin the work, the link is in the description and pinned in the top comment. The S.I.M method. This is the path out of participation mystique and into individuation. It is the structured process for building the self that was never allowed to form. Do not save this video for later. Later is where empaths live. The whole self is built now, in the decision to stop performing the wound and start investigating it. Subscribe if you want to see the next descent. Because there is a great deal more to say, and this channel exists to say it, slowly, without shortcut, without flattery, until you finally meet the person you have been waiting for your entire life. That meeting begins the moment you decide it does. Let it begin now.